You're listening to Skills World Live with Tom Bewick. News, views and interviews in association with FE News. Hello everyone, it's Friday the 1st of May. And in pre-COVID times, that was traditionally the end of the working week. Welcome to episode 7 of Skills World Live. And today also marks 40 days and 40 nights since Britain went into full lockdown mode. Not that any of you have to feel lost in the coronavirus wilderness. Not when you have 60 minutes of debate and discussion to look forward to on the only community radio show connecting the world of FE. And if you're thinking, where did they get this amateur presenter from? Well, the brutal truth, I'm afraid, is that the FE News editor, Kelly O'Mara, only had the budget to cover the voluntary services of a tired old DJ who once lived in Ibiza. That's right, folks. There was once a time, in my much younger years, when the concerns of Skills World seemed a lot more distant than the immediate fun of a manumission phone party. Swapping turntables for worrying about technical skills, here I find myself, Tom Bewick, reinvented as your FE community radio DJ. And what an absolute pleasure it has been too. Thanks as always for all your kind feedback. Nice to know that so many of you listening out there, either live or in playback. Do keep on telling your friends and colleagues all about the show. Tell them Skills World is available on all the usual podcasting sites, including Apple, Spotify and SoundCloud. Please do make sure you give us a like, as well as subscribe to the show's daily updates on fenews.co.uk. Follow me on Twitter, @Tom Bewick. Now, coming up on tonight's show, we've got an issue that stirs a lot of passions on all sides of the higher education debate. Are we sending too many of our young people to university? Are we committing a whole generation of graduates with, on average, £54,000 in student loans debt to a life of usury and servitude, with too many of them in the labour market whipping up those skinny lattes for the high-paid dons of Oxbridge? Or perhaps with COVID-19 and the expected spike in youth and adult unemployment, the holding pen capacity of university campuses will be needed by governments more than ever. So stay tuned for tonight's celebrity lineup of Skills World Live guests, because such is the reach now of this FE community radio show that our editor has been able to tempt on to talk to me this evening, a former Education Secretary of State who was pivotal in driving many of the reforms we see in higher education today, and a think tank boss who is often on our TV screens reviewing the day's papers. And in today's phone chat section of the programme, I'll be talking to not one, but 3 sector leaders about the future of higher technical education and, of course, FE. I'll be asking a careers company boss, why is information, advice and guidance for young people so woeful? But first, let's find out what's making the news headlines in your Skills World this evening. The association representing independent training providers has published overnight a legal letter to the Skills Minister, Gillian Keegan. It accuses her department of acting unlawfully over the implementation of Cabinet Office procurement guidelines, known as the Supply Relief Scheme. The Association of Employment and Learning Providers is being represented by James Gowdy QC. In his letter dated the 27th of April, the top lawyer stated that all apprenticeship providers were operating under public service contracts. Therefore, they were entitled to receive relief under the government scheme. In a detailed submission arguing a number of legal points, the ALPS representatives also accused ministers of an abuse of power. A Department for Education spokesperson confirmed with this programme that the letter had been received and they will provide a response in due course. In other news, the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education has launched a survey of apprentices to gauge their opinion on the value of the apprenticeship programme. and the quality they receive from both employers and training providers. The Chief Executive of the Institute, Jennifer Coupland, said that she was delighted to have boosted the apprenticeship panel by recruiting 20 new members. This would form part of the biggest survey of learner satisfaction that the Institute had concluded so far, she said. And finally, 14 apprentices from Keighley College have been assisting a local engineering company in the manufacture of ventilator parts. Shipley-based Produmax specialises in high-precision engineering, operating globally in partnership with aerospace manufacturers. The firm typically produces machine components and assemblies. However, it has now begun manufacturing ventilator equipment due to the increased demand within the National Health Service. That's all your Skills World news from fenews.uk. Contact us at Skills World Live. Email skillsworld@fenews.co.uk. Follow us on Twitter @Tom Bewick, @FENews. Use the hashtag SkillsWorld. Call us on 02032 900 111. That's 02032 900 111. Okay, that was an uplifting track there selected, especially to get your Friday night lockdown off to a positive start. It was called Tremor by Castizo. Now, tonight's big debate is on the theme of should we abolish the target of sending 50% of our young people to university? And even if the 50% is not in fact an official government target, do we send too many of our young people to university at great taxpayers' expense, with nearly half of the loans taken out by students in the UK never expected to be paid back? Joining us on Skills World Live this evening as my special guest is a man who knows a thing or two about education. In the early 2000s, as the Secretary of State for Education and Skills, he introduced and implemented the major university reforms of the 2004 Higher Education Act. Charles Clarke was also the Member of Parliament for Norwich between 1997 and 2010, and he joins me on the line now. Good evening, Charles.
Good evening, Tom. Nice to join you.
Thank you very much indeed. Now let's start with a question related to tonight's main theme. Do you think it is time that we abolish the target or the ambition of sending half of our young people to university?
Well, as you said in your intro, I don't think there's ever been such a target as such. But as you said in the second part, there is a general increase in number of people going to university. I think that's a good thing. We're still lower than many other parts of the world. And I think we live in a more and more complicated, more and more technologically challenging world. And as we see in these circumstances that we're talking now, ones where expertise and skill really are needed and are necessary. And so I think people will want to go to university and gain the skills that they can achieve from that. So I don't think there is a target, so I don't think it's a question of saying we should abolish it or not. But I do think we should have an increasing aspiration that our young people should go to university, particularly, I may say, Tom, because of the fact that your chance of going to university is far, far higher if you come from the wealthier section of the population than from the less wealthy sections of the population. Sure. And I don't believe that children in the less wealthy areas are less talented or able than people in the wealthier areas.
I don't think it's so much about trying to kick away a ladder of opportunity. I think there are lots of really fantastic stories of people going to university for the first time, perhaps in their family ever. That certainly was the case for me. But when you look at other countries, particularly those that are very and have been very successful industrially, like Germany, like Switzerland, they do send less young people on to higher education. So, there are different examples around the world. Do you think some might say the obsession of sending young people to university is almost as the only pathway to real success has to change?
Well, I don't think it is an obsession. What I do think is there's what I call an escalator mentality of people going through school up the escalator, then many, many people, high proportions of people just expecting to go straight into university without necessarily thinking about it. And I don't think that's a good thing. But I do think that there are very many successful societies, countries like Scandinavia, countries like Australia, countries like Canada, which are extremely successful with very high proportions going to university. Germany and Switzerland come from a different economic tradition, very successful economies, but I don't think their figures of participation in HE are significantly lower than is the case in the UK.
Right. Well, it's about 38% in Germany, and it's actually as low as 29% in Switzerland. Let's move on. Now, I
think that's largely a question of definition, by the way, about what they call higher education.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, interestingly, 2/3 of 16 to 19-year-olds in Switzerland go directly into apprenticeships, although they have the opportunity later on to convert those apprenticeships to university level. Now, you've just co-written a book with the academic neurologist Ed Byrne called University Challenge, Changing Universities in a Changing World. Interestingly, you called on universities to show, and I quote, real change and humility. Well, what did you mean by that?
Well, my fundamental view is that if we're going to deal with the challenges of the world as they come, then we need a very highly educated population, a very highly educated research capacity to identify problems and deal with them. And I don't think universities across the range have a really fantastic record in relation to that. They need to face up to the challenges of the world and to abandon those parts of the university world which are really about living in an ivory tower, people pursuing their own interests. I think we need to face up to the global challenges, and we've got it today more than we could ever see. How do we deal with a pandemic? How do we deal with the economic issues that will flow from it? How do we deal with the sustainability issues? And I think universities have to step up to that plate. And it's no good some parts of the university community saying that's nothing to do with us. I think parts of the university community have been too apart from the rest of society, and I think that's a weakness.
Right. Your book suggests that you're not particularly a big fan of the Office for Students. I mean, just to briefly quote a passage here about the OFS, and I quote, it says, "It could strongly diminish one of the strongest university sectors in the world if the regulatory framework does not respect institutional autonomy over standards, pedagogy and curriculum." Charles, there'll be some listening to this debate this evening, particularly from the world of FE, thinking, why should universities any longer sit in judgment of their own performance?
Well, what I would say is that universities need to make sure that their own performance is what the world is looking from them. The sitting in judgment point implies you have state regulation of every aspect of life. And I don't think there should be state regulation of every aspect of life. I think there should be a much wider, more diverse, more dissipated approach to raising standards and meeting the challenges of society. And I also think, even more seriously, that if you have a top-down ordering mentality of telling universities or FE colleges what to do, I don't think that's a very successful way of proceeding.
I get that, but what do you say to critics who look at the university sector in the UK? I mean, they see university vice-chancellors on sky-high salaries and a sort of negative perception because of the growth, particularly in first-class degree awards and also unconditional offers to students as evidence, frankly, of a race to the bottom in higher education. Where do you sit in that debate?
Well, I don't think there is a race to the bottom. I think there's a whole set of different issues you mentioned there. Firstly, as far as Vice-Chancellor's salaries are concerned, some have been too high. There's no question of that. And they haven't had sufficient accountability for what's gone on in some cases. But the idea that is a central source of the problem of universities, I don't think is right. In terms of unconditional offers, I'm much less exercised about unconditional offers than many people are. I think the question is, will the student benefit from the university experience at the end of the day? And I don't think the question of the conditionality of the offer is such a core thing, particularly, Tom, and this is really a key point, that the way the school system works in the country could hardly be described as equitable in terms of equal chances for everybody to get the qualifications they get. There's a great deal of evidence of highly variable performance in different areas. But where you're right and where I agree with you is there is a sense of disaffection with universities' achievements. I think it's exaggerated, but it's certainly there. And I believe the way to respond to that is for universities themselves to step up to the plate in a way they aren't always doing, in the way that's needed.
Moving on to the impact of COVID-19, how do the sort of 4 objectives, which you very neatly set out, I thought, in your book, for the future of higher education, and it included, obviously, an objective around higher education in future having to specialise more, particularly for those technical skills where we know in Britain in particular we've got a productivity gap. Do you see any of those 4 objectives shifting as a result of the pandemic and the crisis we find ourselves in?
Well, the 4 objectives I said were understand and interpret the process of change. I don't think that will change. I think it becomes more necessary. Secondly, offering approaches that would harness the process of change for general benefit, also the same. Educating and training people is going to become more necessary, not less necessary, and creating an intellectually engaging climate is also absolutely central to the approach. What will change is a number of very big specifics. One is the reduction of international students, which have been a cushion of high fee value to universities and not much value given back, which has directly subsidised university research, which will no longer be sustainable on that basis. The second is a need to shift to online and distance learning in a way which I think will be very important. The third is the economic issues which universities will face, and they most certainly will, as a result of this process. I think will tend to encourage a process of what I'd loosely call mergers and acquisitions in universities, that they have to think very much harder about cooperating. And you talk rightly about the FE colleges. There are some universities which have developed very strong and positive relationships with FE colleges in their locality. I think that should happen far more, and I think the COVID-19 crisis will make that happen faster.
Yeah, but I was going to ask you obviously about the interaction with our FE colleges. A lot of listeners are working in our further education colleges. A lot are also expecting to see the government publish its response to the so-called Auger Review, which obviously has looked at the whole sort of system of post-16 education and skills in England and has come up with a suggestion that in future the focus really should be more on level 4 and level 5 qualifications. Would you support that shift?
In general, I think the Auger Committee has been really quite positive in trying to ensure that many courses which are currently not supported are supported in the system that should exist at the moment. So I hope that most aspects of the Auger Committee report will be supported, and I set out clearly the basis for that in the book. I think there are some big questions here about the way in which it should be dealt with. You correctly pointed at the beginning of this interview to the fact that the repayment of university loans is not as high as it should be, and that's a direct result of decisions that were taken in 2011 to raise the threshold of repayment of those. And I think you do need to create a more sustainable financial system than we have at the moment. And I think Auger makes a number of very positive proposals in that direction.
Okay. Now, it's fair to say that you generally have quite an optimistic view of globalisation, as indeed does Tony Blair, who you work with as both Education and Home Secretary. Indeed, in the book, you warn of the dangers of nativist populism. But is there anything about the current crisis, for example, the way we've become so dependent on just-in-time supply chains from places like China and people's concerns about open borders? Does any of that help you perhaps reevaluate your views on globalisation and the role of higher education?
Well, I mean, there's so many things you're saying in that question, Tom. I don't think we have open borders. I don't think we've ever had open borders, and I don't think we should have open borders. But I do think...
Well, we don't now, that's for sure, do we?
Well, you can talk about EU or not, but in general, I mean, I was the Home Secretary who brought in a set of proposals, established a point system, which created quite stiff requirements for people migrating into the UK from outside the European Union. I did that in 2005. But anyway, without going through the ins and outs of that whole process, globalisation is a process which has been happening and will continue to happen. But it's left a large chunk of the population and parts of the world behind, which has in turn given rise to the populist movements, the people like Donald Trump, the Brexit campaign, which have taken place. As I argue in the book, and I've got a whole chapter on this particular point, the universities can be, and there's plenty of examples of this, the means to regenerate those areas which have been left behind by globalization. And that's one of the reasons I argue for very strong local relationships of universities with their local communities to strengthen that. And I think that's the way to deal with the issues we're talking about.
Sure. And I think you make that point very well. Now, finally, as former Education Secretary, can I ask you whether you would have done anything different to Gavin Williamson in terms of that difficult decision to cancel this summer's examinations?
Well, that's a very tough call. I'm not sure the government's handled it very well, actually. I think you have to have a very graduated approach to the ways that schools will come back and be opened in due course. And I think that the results, particularly for A-level students, have been very, very distressing through the process, also for GCSE students. The idea that kids don't want to do the exams, I think, is completely wrong. And I think the government hasn't found a good approach to allow people to be able to do that more effectively. Now, in defence of the government, it all happened very quickly, and to establish a whole new system in a very rapid period of time would have been exceptionally difficult. So I'm not going to put my hand on my heart and say I would have done better than Gavin Williamson in this regard. But I do believe that you need a far more careful, considered approach than we've so far seen.
Right, Honourable Charles Clarke, former Labour Cabinet Minister. Thanks for joining me on Skills World this evening.
Thanks, Tom, and good luck with all you're doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cheerio. Bye.
Bye. That was Charles Clarke there, a man who's always got opinions on education. Join us after the break. We'll carry on the chat.
The rain is forming into rivers outside, writing down all the things that I missed, and in the letters you did form. No, I won't go back tonight with the habits of the restless me. I'm leaving all that stuff behind. We can start all over in our hometown. Run with me, it could be everything that we once tasted. I'm in
That's Daxton. Fall into place. You know, a colleague said to me today that the songs I choose on this show are too good for Eurovision, but not quite as catchy as a top 40 chart topper. Now, to continue the debate, are we sending too many of our young people to university? Should we abolish the ambition or the target of a 50% of young people going through the higher education system? I'm delighted to continue that discussion now with Claire Fox, who's the Director of the Academies of Ideas, and Nick Hillman, Director of the Higher Education Policy Institute. Good evening to you both.
Hi.
Hi. Claire, let's start with you first. I mean, let's just get straight to the heart of the matter. Do you think we should send less young people to university?
I definitely think we should abolish the 50% target. I think the original aspiration of removing all barriers to access for ordinary people to go to university was a wonderful ideal, because it meant that university could be for everyone. But it didn't mean that everyone should go. It meant that it didn't matter what your social background was. If you had the right academic qualifications, go. What's now happened, though, is that universities have almost become a kind of route to market, the job market, and it's completely distorted how we see people who work. And what about the 50% who don't go, who are often treated like second-class citizens?
Absolutely. Now, Nick, you're the Nick Hillman, the Director of the Higher Education Policy Institute. I mean, you're on record as saying that you'd like to see more people go to university. Is that correct?
Yes, I've actually called for a target of 70%. I mean, we've hit 50% already. The latest data.
So why a target? I mean, what's meaningful about 70% as opposed to 50%, as opposed to 90% or 10%? What's the point?
Well, the useful thing about a target is it allows people to prepare for something that I think is close to inevitable. If you look at other developed countries, they've all gone on increasing the number of graduates. None of them have cut the number of graduates. And many of our key competitors send far more people to university than we do. And I think you can worry about the people who don't go to university at the same time as wanting expansion of higher education. I think you can do both things concurrently.
You're absolutely right. You just have to be an either or. But Claire, do you think the nation can afford to send potentially 70% of young people through to university, particularly when already half of them are not paying their loans back?
Well, I mean, the prior question has to now be, what is university for? I mean, obviously you could have 100% of people go to university. What is the point of a university? And I think the unique contribution of the university, which is a place for people who want to explore the life of the mind, who are academic, who are interested in knowledge for its own sake and so on, is getting lost in this. And those people who say, well, no, we have to have more and more graduates because that's what you need to be these days to get a job, are not understanding that it's precisely this expansion which has distorted the job market. So you now get into a situation where, for example, just to use an example I think you've discussed earlier this week, which is, nursing has suddenly become a graduate job. And there's a whole range of jobs that are now associated with getting a degree. Whereas the point of going to university was not that you got a better job, but that you were actually given the privilege of 3 years to explore knowledge and ideas and be educated at a higher level. And in fact, often people, my generation, would get better jobs because they didn't go to university. But I think this idea that it's an entrance qualification for the job market is where it actually has become more of a hindrance than a help, and has led to a real elitism in terms of vocational education that's not degree, not gained through a university. I'd like to see a much greater emphasis on training, on apprenticeships given higher status and so on. I just don't think you need to go to university to get a job. You should go to university for every other reason than that.
Nick, the problem that obviously from Claire's perspective is credentialism. I mean, effectively, the universities stand accused of operating a system not too dissimilar from medieval guilds, a sort of protectionist approach to those insiders in the labour market, and those who don't have the credentials are therefore cast aside as outsiders. And nursing was given as one such example, but it's happening across the professions. What do you say to that claim that effectively universities have, whether deliberately or not, have sort of almost ended up acting as a cartel in aspects of the British labour market and recruitment entry?
Well, I don't think it's true because I don't think the evidence supports it. So let's take the example of nursing. There have been huge global comparisons of the records of hospitals judged against what proportion of their nurses are graduates and what proportion are not. And we know it's absolutely clear that nurses who are graduates help provide safer hospital environments for their patients than nurses who aren't. So if going to university was just about spending a lot of money on a bit of paper that was mere credentializing, as you say, rather than any meaningful education, I would agree with you, but the evidence doesn't back that up. And the other thing I think is different now to in the past is, in general, people are living longer. In general, life expectancy has been going up quite fast in recent decades. And as people live longer, people tend to want more education. And so, in the old days, that was a debate about the school leaving age. Now it's a debate about how many people should stay on for higher or indeed further education.
So what do you then say? Sorry, Claire, come in. Go on.
No, well, I was just going to straight away say that, first of all, as people are living longer, I'd be all for having access courses that allow people older in life to maybe do degrees should they want to. I know lots of people who've worked, very, very hard, long hours and have then got a taste for art history or any number of academic things and would love to go to university. And I'd like to see investment in that to facilitate them and to allow them to do that. That's just a different question. But on your nurses' point, nurses who do degrees, lead to safer hospitals. I mean, first of all, I'm not entirely confident that isn't just an insult to those people who were nursing in the past. But of course you can be a nurse and have a better standard of nurse training. I'm just querying whether it needs to be a university as a mechanism for giving that credential. And of course you'll just end up with saying, well, why don't we have care workers do degrees? That might be what comes out of the coronavirus. We recognise care workers. But that's not what I think is required. I think that what you need to do is maybe pay better wages, but is whether the university is the place for it. And one of the consequences, by the way, of attaching universities to jobs in this way is something that's happening in Sunderland at the moment, which is Sunderland University's just announced it's getting rid of its non-job related humanities courses, because once you turn it into just simply a mechanism for getting a job, you also devalue what universities are. The truth is that 50% might be going into a building with the word university above it, but they're not getting a university education as has ever been understood. And now you can just say, well, this is a changing nature of what we understand a university to be. But I just feel it's smoke and mirrors and it's disingenuous. And a lot of people are actually not getting a university education, but a lot of people are not getting jobs because they haven't gone through the process of something that describes itself as university education. So
on the labour market destinations of graduates, I mean, you talked a bit about evidence tonight, Nick, and I'm sure your institute is at the forefront of evidence-based research in higher education. But what do you say to graduates, who look at, for example, the wage progression data coming out of courses that's been captured by the Institute for Fiscal Studies based on tax returns, that's finding more and more that the wages of graduates, these are degree holders, has been pushed down in recent times. And in fact, that's had a chilling effect, therefore, on those non-graduates and their wages at the bottom of the labour market. And what also do you say to the OECD's research, which has found in terms of the graduate underemployment rate, as it's described, we've got the worst underemployment rate after Latvia and Ireland in terms of our higher education graduates. How does that shape up in terms of the future of higher education?
Well, let me make 3 points. The first is just to come back on Claire's conception of higher education, which I think is ahistorical, because higher education was originally about training people for the priesthood, then it was about training people for law and medicine. And the origins of higher education in this country were vocational. Higher education has always had a vocational element to it. So I my own view is that's a red herring. On the wage returns of higher education, look, I don't want to bore your listeners with all the inner technical details of that Institute for Fiscal Studies worker you refer to, but I'll just say one thing about it. It was looking at graduates who emerged during the last recession. Looks like we're heading for another one, but
that was the Great Recession. Now it's the Great Depression.
Last recession.
Yeah.
Yeah, but one thing we know about being a graduate in the last recession was that you may have ended up getting lower paid work than graduates before you, but you were more likely to be in work. So it was an insurance policy being a graduate against unemployment. And on your final point about OECD data, I mean, one thing the OECD always says about the UK is that we lack a lot of people with level 4, level 5 skills. So skills which are not equivalent to a full university degree, but are a form of higher education, HNDs, HNCs, things like that. And some people think, well, that means we should downgrade people who are doing degrees and get them doing level 4, level 5 qualifications. But that's not what the evidence shows. The evidence shows where we have more people is in very low skills. So people who leave school with just level 2 or level 3, so just equivalent of GCSE or equivalent of A-level. And what I would love to see more good quality vocational training in colleges, level 4, level 5. But the people I think should be doing that, the people who are currently being let down because they're leaving education with just a level 2 or a level 3 qualification. And we should be raising their skills rather than telling people who are going to university they shouldn't be going.
Claire, the last word to you.
Yeah, the things it does seem to me to be linked. I mean, if philosophically, I mean, whatever about my ahistoric, if it's the case that, Nick, you are saying that universities now should be vocational centres of training for work, then let's have that as an honest declaration, because then that will change philosophically what a university is for. And precisely because they've been accepted now as the route into jobs, what has happened is there's been a neglect of those, as you pointed out, low-skilled people who are not having the kind of training that they should be having, because the further education sector is now treated, if it was a Cinderella service before, is now absolutely a forgotten orphan, because everybody concentrates on higher education. And the only aspiration is to go to higher education. And therefore, good quality jobs, good quality training for half of the young people in this country are neglected. You know, even the extension of the school leaving age to the age of 18 is all about university, you know, getting into universities. So people are not going to university with a joy in their heart because they want to study and because they're interested in the life of the mind, as I said, but because it's the only way you can get a job. And that cuts out a lot of people and ends up using one sector as a job market and the other sector inevitably is neglected. And that's exactly what's happened and what I object to.
So it's the other 50%, Claire, you're talking about, and essentially
yes,
sort of educational monoculture that says, we should be going to university. Yeah. Nick, quick riposte on that, and then we must end this segment.
I think it's really nice to be able to end on a point of agreement, because I think there's a huge amount in what Claire says, and I think after this current crisis is over and we are all poorer and there's less money to be spent, I think we're going to have to think very creatively about what universities offer and what our colleges offer and whether they should be doing more things together, and thinking all about a lot of this stuff afresh. And the general point that Claire is making, that a lot of people have been forgotten about, is one I wholeheartedly agree with. I don't think it's an argument for weakening our universities, but it jolly well is a very strong argument for strengthening our colleges.
Okay, it's always good on this show to end on some agreement. Claire Fox, Director of the Academy of Ideas. Nick Hillman, Director of Higher Education Policy Institute. Thanks for coming on the show this evening.
Thanks. Brilliant show. Thanks.
You're listening to Skills World Live with Tom Bewick. That's Alex Dovo and a track called Makes Me Feel. So if you haven't had enough debate tonight already, on tonight's big debate theme, which is, should we abolish the target of sending 50% of our young people to university? I'm delighted to be joined on the line by not one, not two, but three contributors. First of all, can I introduce Anne Lim, who is the Vice Chair at City and Guilds. We've got Steve Stewart on the line at Careers England and Sonia Riyait from Leicester College. Welcome to all of you on Skills World Live. First of all, Anne, let's start with you. What's your view on tonight's big debate? Are we sending too many young people to university?
Well, I think having a target in itself is a rather crude way to bring about change. I suppose it's what it represents, which is an aspiration to get on in life. But my standpoint is that there's not just one route to achieve your ambition and aspiration. And not surprisingly, having had a career in further education, I'm very biased, if you like, although consciously so, about the importance of social mobility and technical and vocational learning. And I think trying to just follow a university route because of what it symbolises, and we've heard that in the earlier debate, is alienating. It's falsifying and distorting the situation of the lived experience of many students in FE. And it indirectly as well perpetuates a kind of class division and inequity that exists. So I'm not in favour of it, basically, Tom.
Right. Sonia, you run a FE college. You must look at the... I am. Yeah, hi. You must look at the higher education world in terms of its autonomy and around its curriculum and what have you. And you must look quite jealously at some of the freedoms that they've got compared to FE.
Well, I think, coming from a further education college, and obviously that, the careers team do assist a lot of our students into higher education. Just in the last academic year, we assisted 650 students into higher education. But we see our role as incredibly important in terms of preparing students for the next step of the career ladder. This symbolic target of I suppose assisting 50%, at least 50% of a cohort of young people into higher education is interesting. I think what we're finding, however, is that increasingly we're meeting a lot of younger people who are interested in alternative routes. A lot of young people are extremely savvy. They are worried about things like course costs, for example. And it might not be that university now is necessarily the route that they want to explore. There's absolutely nothing wrong with raising aspirations in young people. Yeah. And as a college, we work extremely hard to do that. But increasingly, young people are more interested in alternative routes. So things like higher apprenticeships and degree apprenticeships. Now, what we are concerned about is the number of young people who apply to university and are not really quite sure that they're doing the right thing, or at least aren't aware of the other options either. As a career service, we wouldn't be doing our jobs or conforming to the Gatsby benchmarks if we weren't at least making young people aware of their other options. Now, from a personal point of view, I didn't go to university until I was a mature student. I worked. Right.
Me too.
As soon as I left college, and it was the best decision I ever made because it allowed me to fully explore the other options and think about the alternatives. When I did go, I knew exactly what I wanted to do.
All right. Well, let's talk about those options, because I just want to bring in our third contributor in this segment, Steve Stewart from Careers England. I think from what both Sonia has said so far and also Anne, it's really about this sort of bind, we find ourselves in the post-16 skills and education system in England, where it's almost like, you have to choose between either a learning and earning route, which, as we know, is not always open to young people, not at the quality level that they perhaps might expect, and also what I've called the pay and pray route. It's kind of get off to university, get the 3 letters after your name, have the graduation ceremony, and let's just hope you get a job that pays above average earnings. What's the Careers England perspective on all that, Steve?
Well, I think it's very simple in my mind. I think the target's a bit past its sell-by date. I mean, if you cast your mind back to when the target was set, it was about actually how we can make the economy a knowledge-based economy, and we'll design and do the very clever work, and others will in other parts of the world will kind of make things. Well, that if you look today at what's happening, we've got a major problem with skill shortages in this country. Mm-hmm. At the same time as we've got a major problem with that, if you look at our unemployment figures, the group that actually suffers the most are young people, 16 to 24. So we actually need a system of education that actually helps the economy. I think there's two other points I'd make. The second point is nobody ever realised just what a problem this target was going to cause in terms of individual debt and the impact of that on young people for life. And indeed, the idea was it was well researched at the time. The more you learn, the more you earn. Graduates will learn more than anybody else. Well, of course, we now know that that's not quite the same.
Well, that was certainly the promise 2 decades ago, but I think as some of the stats now show, that isn't necessarily the case. Yeah. Although, I did look at some figures the other day that said if you've got an economics degree from the London School of Economics, then you can expect a starter salary of about £80,000. So clearly it is working for some graduates, even if it's not working for others. Exactly. Well, let's explore that further with Anne Lim. So, Anne, City and Guilds, focus very much on technical, high quality technical and vocational education. Where are you on the sort of either or debate? Learn and earn, pay and pray.
Yes, I love that phrase. Actually, the pray bit relates to something I was just going to mention in connection with Steve's last point and this topic you've introduced. Actually, when City and Guilds did some research called Great Expectations in 2015, they found that only in the region of 30% of jobs were actually at graduate level, but there were huge skills gaps, as Steve's just mentioned, at other levels. And so, actually, if 50% of people have gone to university and are graduates, but there's only 30% of jobs, I mean, no wonder you've got graduates doing jobs that necessarily did not fulfil their expectations. Yeah. But I think that the other key point here is that there are people in the workplace as well where we need to ensure that we've got a workforce, an economy, as Steve says, fed by the FE colleges like Sonia's, that are training people with the kind of skills that are needed, or retraining people for the jobs of now and for the future. And they're not necessarily graduate level jobs, they're technical and vocational, work related.
Absolutely. And indeed, what's really interesting during COVID-19, looking at the critical occupation list that the COBRA has produced, the vast majority of those occupations don't require, or haven't traditionally anyway, require a university degree. Sonia, you talked about, in your intro, you talked about how young people are savvy. And my 14-year-old is reminding me how much more savvier he is than me on a regular occasion. But actually, I think there is some truth in the fact that increasingly you are seeing young people sort of vote with their feet, if you like. They're not necessarily persuaded to go down the university route, although one wouldn't want to, as I said to Charles Clarke, kick the ladder of opportunity away from them. What are you seeing at Leicester College in terms of the kinds of occupational routes that young people themselves are saying they want to pursue that may or may not require a university degree?
So, I mean, we have obviously a variety of different courses. So, for example, there are students who they're always going to be interested in the health professions, and not all careers in health professions require a university degree. There are various professions within that particular field that don't require them. There are students who are interested in the creative fields as well. So we offer a number of courses in the creative fields. Now, they don't always need particularly a degree, although obviously that would help with things like networking. We will always have subjects where, for example, perhaps parents of young people would want them to think about doing or studying subjects in, for example, the STEM areas. I mean, there's been a lot of drive in, obviously, those particular areas. And we are always in touch with students who, want to explore those fields as well. I think, yeah.
Okay, great. Now, Steve, final word to you, because we've only got 30 seconds left of the show in that sense. What's your view on information, advice and guidance? I mean, I made the point at the start of the show, it's woeful. That's what I pick up from my colleagues in the sector. Is that a fair accusation, though, to make about information, advice and guidance? 20 seconds.
I think there's a third of colleges and schools, for example, doing it very, very well. There's a third who, because of money and also the focus, are doing some things probably not very well. And there's probably around a third of our schools and colleges who are doing, because of all kinds of reasons, mainly finance and other direction, aren't doing very much at all.
Okay.
You put that together, and we're not fit to.
It's not fit for purpose.
Prepare for the future for our young people.
Okay, alas, that's all we got time for, I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen. But Anne Lim, Steve Stewart, Sonia Riyait, thank you so much for joining Skills World.
Great to be with you.
Thank you.
I told you every single time, don't you worry. You would always call me at the wrong time, so you could know what I was up to. Oh, don't you get that it's stupid? Hey, just hear me out. It's been a while since we were good, so why we dragging out when we've been doing everything we could?
Okay, folks, it's that time of the week again. But if you haven't cracked open a strong beverage by now, chances are you never will. Do join us live again on Monday when I'll be asking the question, starts falling for apprenticeships? What is all the fuss about? Don't forget that if you want to be on the show, contact us, skillsworld@fenews.co.uk. You can also call us on 02032 900 111. And one of our wonderful Skills World Live team will get back to you. Thanks as ever to the show's editor, Kelly O'Mara, and our digital producer, Ellie Hansen. Skills World Live is an FE News production supported by the Federation of Awarding Bodies Platinum Partners Programme. Subscribe to Skills World Live at fenews.co.uk/Skills World.